This was a 4-week trip. It took us through a number of countries in Africa. Of course, as I mentioned to you before, a lot of Africa was colonized by European powers, almost all of it was, and France was one of the major colonizing powers of the time. So those countries today that were former colonies of France, they still speak French, and they still have kept certain elements of French culture as well. So that's why we end up working in this part of the world in the French department. So the first country that we went to was Ivory Coast, and if you can follow the arrows here, I will take you through basically the itinerary, and then I'll just show you some pictures of each place as we continue on. So we spent almost a week here in Ivory Coast because there's a lot going on there, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. We continued on to Lomé in Togo, a very long, narrow country, and from there we went on to Cameroon and spent about 4 or 5 days in Cameroon visiting some remote scattered brethren, and you'll see some photos of them shortly. We went down to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Kinshasa, a very chaotic, rather dangerous place, as are a number of places now in Africa. Then we crossed the continent, ended up in Kenya. We were to have continued on directly from Kenya to Burundi, but if you've been following the news, you know that there's a lot of pre-electoral trouble going on in Burundi right now, and I will give you an update about that when we reach that part of the trip. So we ended up spending a few extra days in Kenya because I made the choice that it simply wasn't safe for us to go to Burundi at this time. And then following a couple of the forced days that we had in Kenya, then we went on to Rwanda, which was our last stop on this trip, and then we flew back out again. I say we because my colleague and co-worker, Mr. Daniel Harper, was able to accompany me on this trip. He's just recently been hired to work in the French department. He speaks French very well, as does his wife, lived in France for a number of years, both of them. And we're very happy to have Mr. Harper join the French department team. So he'll be traveling with me periodically through the year. He'll be working with a pastor in the Atlanta area as well, Mr. Bruce Gore, to get some training, I guess you would say, on the ground here in the States as far as pastoring churches. And then he'll be traveling with me in the French-speaking parts of the world and helping out with various projects there as well. So let me go through now and just show you some scenes of the lives of many of our church brethren in this part of the world. The first place that we landed, my battery is running low. I feel fine. I felt that full charge this morning, but anyway, I assume the technicians will be working on that up there. This is Abidjan, which is the economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire, as it's called, or sometimes Ivory Coast. Côte d'Ivoire is the official name. That's French for Ivory Coast, so sometimes people translate it, although officially the name is given in French. It's a very large cosmopolitan city. It's one of the more developed cities in West Africa, except that they had a very destructive civil war that went on for more than a decade. And so the infrastructure suffered a great deal. So you have some of these very tall, modern-looking buildings, and then you'll see that things are just crumbling right next to them. Not too very long ago, when the Civil War finally came to an end with one great crescendo right in Abidjan, a lot of the windows of these buildings were shot out during the combat. So when I came in just shortly after that occurred, I mean, it really did look like a war zone. There had been fighting, artillery, heavy weapons that had been used right in the center of the city here. So most of that's been erased now. That took place a couple of years ago, but it is quite sobering to see something like that in what looks to be a very modern city, and in fact, in many ways is. We have a small congregation of members that lives just about 45 minutes outside of Abidjan by car, and this is their meeting hall. We constructed just a very simple thing for them to be able to listen to sermons on the Sabbath, to sit together on chairs that we purchased for them. There's just a group of 6 or 8 people that meet here normally, but they did need a place of their own to be able to congregate. Sometimes people ask, well, why don't they just meet in a house? If I would show you a picture, and perhaps I should have done that, of what the inside of a house looks like, you would understand immediately. They're extremely small, and there's simply no room. You can't get 6 or 8 people sitting in a room comfortably inside one of the houses, which are made of mud bricks. So to have something like this, a little bit more spacious, as you can imagine, didn't cost very much to put it up. But this is the normal meeting hall for our church brethren in Lomé. And they live in houses, as I mentioned, made of mud brick with tin roofs. dirt floors. They do their cooking over charcoal fires. They don't actually have a kitchen. Usually it's just outside over sometimes they'll use the wheel of a car with the tire taken off. That might be their grill. And so that's kind of that's the common way for them to live and to cook. Here's Mr. Harper giving a Bible study inside the hall, so you have an idea of what it looks like on the inside. You can see people sitting on benches and plastic chairs. This would be a typical way that they would pass the Sabbath day. One of the high points of our first visit that we made to Lamé was the baptism of a new sister in Christ. I've been working with a woman named Elise. I won't do family names because you'd have a hard time pronouncing them, and I almost guarantee you wouldn't remember them anyway. So we'll just stick with first names. But I've been working with counseling with Elise for over a year, and this time we were able to have another counseling, and she was ready to be baptized. So we arranged to go down to the freshwater lagoon, which takes about 20 minutes to get there by vehicle. And this is the kind of vehicle that people use locally. This is just a little trailer pulled by a motorcycle. This is what passes as mass transportation in the area of Lamé. And you'd be surprised how many people you can get in one of those trailers. You'll see in a moment when you see the group portrait that I took at the end. Of course, we had a few in the car. Lise was with us because she was quite pregnant. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. So we had probably 4 or 5 people in the car, and everybody else was in this trailer. So we trundled down about 20 minutes down to a lagoon, and I asked Mr. Harper and Paul Tia to perform the actual baptism, and then Mr. Harper and I did the laying on of hands afterwards. So this was most of the group there, and you can see I've put a circle around Elise. She doesn't look as pregnant as she actually was because people are very, very thin. They don't weigh very much because of the conditions in which they live. But it turned out that when we came back, about 5 days after our trip up country, she had given birth to a very healthy baby, which I'll show you a photo of that just a little bit later. So we have a new sister in Christ, and this was a very, very happy occasion for all of us. The next thing on the agenda was to travel up north and west. We were going up to the region of the mountain region in the west of the country. And this is around the city of Man, M-A-N, or as it's pronounced in French, Mans. And this is an area where we've had quite a bit of church activity since about 2009. And so we've been baptizing people regularly, have baptized about 20 people in this region since I started visiting up there, as I said, in 2009. The trip up is rather an epic trip. It takes about 7 or more hours to make it up there. The first half, the roads are quite good, and then they get steadily worse until you actually pull into Man. This is the good part as we're leaving Abidjan. And this is an interesting event that you see quite frequently on the roads. So many people are just trying to get by. If you would actually look at the percentage of people who actually have a job, where they go to a job every day in an office and have a salary at the end of the month, it probably will only be about 15 or 20% of the whole population. And most people just get by. They do odd jobs. They're just hustling, not in the dishonest sense, but they really have to just hustle to try to find enough food at the end of the day to have something to eat. So anytime on the road there's a place where cars need to slow down, you will get a crowd of hawkers who will charge up there, They'll run alongside the vehicle, holding up whatever it is that they have for sale, hoping that somebody will stop and that they can make a few cents. So this is what happens when the vehicle actually stops. The roads are not very good, but you still have to pay tolls, and every time you stop at the toll booth, you just get swarmed by these young people who are holding up apples and cola nuts and toilet paper and just Fanta, anything they think that you might be interested in. And so you just look out the window and decide if you want to buy something and what that might be. You also see a lot of accidents here. We saw probably counted half a dozen just getting to Yamoussoukro, the capital, which is about the first half of the trip. There are wrecks all over the place, and this is one of the most dangerous things for foreigners, actually, when traveling in Africa, are car accidents. The roads are very bad. The vehicles are usually not in very good shape. So one of the biggest risks to travelers in the area is traffic accidents, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. You also see some kind of interesting things, like this is a whole pickup truck full of French bread. And it's not wrapped up in anything. They just stuff the loaves in the back of the truck. It's dirty and gritty, dust in the air, and they're driving their baker's truck off to wherever, and people are going to be getting more than they bargained for with their sandwiches a little later in the day. Now, I also wanted to mention here, I don't have a pointer on this particular clicker, but I want to just mention a few things about the Ebola crisis that happened recently, because our members that live in the region of Man were pretty close to where that outbreak was. You'll notice here, this is Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, and the red areas are newly active areas, the most recent ones. The orange areas are the active areas. Now, this is just about wound down now, and they've declared one of the countries completely free of Ebola, but this was not the case even just very recently. So Man is the red dot that you can see over in Côte d'Ivoire, and it's only about 50, 60, 70 miles from the border, and right at the border there were cases of Ebola. So one of the things that the authorities had declared on the Côte d'Ivoire side, as in these other countries, was that they forbade the consumption of game meat, or as it's called in Africa, bush meat. And bush meat basically means anything you find in the bush, and I mean anything. I'll give you some examples here in a moment. But it's been found by researchers that bush meat is actually one of the main vectors through which Ebola first makes it into the human reservoir, and then it gets transferred from one human to another. But they've tracked down a lot of the outbreaks of Ebola to people consuming contaminated bushmeat, especially monkey and bat. And so I may have shared this story with you once before. When I was up there on my previous trip, I went up to Man. The health authority said, "Oh, and by the way, avoid the bat soup." I said, "No problem." Wasn't intending to partake of the bat soup. But because they were so close to the border, even on the Côte d'Ivoire side, the authorities were telling them, don't eat any meat, because if they allowed any meat to be sold in the marketplace, somebody was going to slip some bush meat in there. People who are this poor and this desperate, they just can't observe the niceties, and they don't really necessarily understand the importance even of what they're doing there. So meat was just outlawed. At the Feast of Tabernacles last year, our brethren in the area of Man, all they ate at the feast in the way of animal protein was fish. They were not allowed to eat any kind of meat. Now, what is bush meat? Let me show you some photos that I've compiled over the years. Giant forest snails, that's what these are. You can probably just make out and see the size of what they are. They get very large. I'm told they taste like chicken. Large, giant forest crabs, and they'll gather these up, and you will see people holding these up along the side of the road. There'll be boys that have been out in the forest, and they've gathered this stuff together, and they'll just hold it up on the side of the road until somebody stops. I don't have a good picture of a monkey for sale, but that's quite frequent. This is a large rodent called the grass cutter in Ghana, and in the French areas it's called the agouti, and this is often sold as bushmeat as well. And it's pretty widely, at least it was, quite widely accepted. It often ends up being sold something like this. They will hold it up fresh for a day or two. After that, they'll smoke it, and they lay it out. You can see how the large, flat skins on the left there, that is prepared grass cutter that's been cooked and smoked. And they can keep that for a few extra days without refrigeration. So you'll see that on the side of the road as well. The large dark object that you see in the back on the right, I wish I could use the pointer here, but in the back of the table on the right, that's a flying fox. That's a giant bat. And that's actually a specialty in certain areas. People really like. It was no joke when they said the bat soup, because it's a spicy soup that people really like. They enjoy eating it, and they think that may be one of the ways, it's one of the probable ways that the Ebola got from the area of the Congo, where the previous outbreaks had been, all the way over into West Africa. One of the theories is that it was a bat migration that did that, and then people ate the bats over in West Africa. And in the lower right corner, I have no idea actually what that is. I can't tell you. But only rarely do you find bushmeat that's clean. In fact, on this last trip, and I didn't put a slide in to show it to you, but I actually saw an antelope that was for sale on the side of the road, and that was the first clean animal that I'd seen being sold like that. And actually, it's outlawed. You're not supposed to do this. The health authorities have outlawed all the selling of bushmeat and consumption of bushmeat. But like I said, old habits die hard. These are extremely poor people, and if they can get it, they'll eat it. That's just kind of the way it goes for them. So on our way up to Man, we saw a lot a lot of what we saw, bushmeat for sale for one thing, and then you just see a lot of stands like this along the side of the road. This is how a lot of Africans get by. They'll try to do some sort of commerce. These girls are selling smoked fish, so fish that's been fished out of a river. They'll smoke it. It doesn't look appetizing at all, but people are used to eating that, and when you put it in a sauce and put it over rice or cassava or something of that nature, they like it. As I mentioned, the roads get progressively worse the closer that you get to Man, and there are certain stretches where there's no pavement at all, and during the rainy season, obviously, it gets highly rutted. You really need a four-wheel drive to be able to safely make this trip up, and that's what we were using this time. And then finally, we make it into Man. This is the city of Man itself. The streets have been recently redone here. When I first started going up here, there was nothing but dirt, clouds of dust coming up from the streets, but they have repaved them now since the end of the Civil War. And we arrived in Man about 2 hours before sundown, so it was time for us to prepare to keep the Passover, because that was the ceremony that we were going to celebrate that evening. We had rented a hall in this little place here, which actually belongs to another religious group, and this was the setup that we had for the Passover. We were 17 to take the Passover. I mentioned that I baptized about 20 people altogether. A couple were not able to make it because they were traveling, and a couple of others had died since their baptism. So we were 17 for the Passover by the light of one small light. That's all we had, was one electric light to light the whole room. And as Mr. Harper reached the scripture reading at the end of the Passover service, we had a torrential rainstorm that came in. And of course, the roofs are made of corrugated tin. You can imagine what it sounds like inside a building when you have a tropical rainstorm coming down. And Mr. Harper sort of was reading, and he looked over at me like, "Now what do I do?" And I said, "Well, just read as loud as you can. They don't usually last very long," and they didn't. So that was how the Passover occurred. And I'll just mention one other thing on a personal level. This is something that's never happened to me before, and probably hasn't happened to very many pastors, at least not lately. Because it's been my privilege to serve in this area and basically be the only one in the churches of God that's come up to this area until perhaps very recently. All of the people, aside from Mr. Harper and myself, who took the Passover there, I'd had the privilege of baptizing them. And that's the first time that anything like that has ever happened to me. So that was a thought-provoking moment. The next day, we started out to spend a whole day visiting remote groups where there are interested people. And what has happened is because people in this part of the world are very interested in religion in general, Christianity in particular, what has happened is that we got a core group of church members there, and what some of them have volunteered to do is just move into different villages to be a light to that village. And they'll go in there and they'll find a plot of ground to farm, or they'll do some little business. And then in the course of normal events of life, people will find out that they keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and they don't worship on Sunday like everybody else, and they do other things that are different. And oftentimes, simply as a result of the examples of someone who's living his life differently, there will be other people who come along and express an interest. So what we were doing was making the rounds. We visited 8 villages in one day, and the procedure was pretty much the same in each one. We would officially be presented to the village chief or chiefs, the chief and his advisors perhaps, and they would welcome us and give us permission to work, to hold Bible studies or services in the village. And sometimes there would be a request that would come along with it, like, would you not please build them a nice church building in the village? And we would say, well, we'll see. So after being introduced to the chief and being welcomed officially, usually they would give us the official form of welcome in this part of Africa is an orange Fanta. And that's hospitality. So I feel like I looked a little orange by the end of the day because we had one in every village that we went to. And you have to drink at least a little of the orange Fanta. That's hospitality, as I mentioned. So this is what it looks like. Here we have a group of people that had gotten together in one of the villages, and after being introduced or welcomed by the chief, then I would usually be asked to say a few words, and I would give something like a sermonette. I would pick a topic that seemed to be helpful or useful to the particular setting, and I would just talk for 12 or 15 minutes about something. That's expected. The chief wants to hear what you have to say. It's a way for them to kind of get to know you a little bit. So I would talk about things like, I'd pick a topic like, why does our church keep annual holy days? Why is tomorrow the first day of unleavened bread? I would talk about that. In another village, it would, when they'd had a recent death of someone beloved in the village, I would talk about what happens after death. What does the Bible actually say about that? And then once I finish with my sort of prepared, more or less comments, then they can ask questions. And we would get questions. Sometimes they were, the chief would ask things like, okay, tell me, why does your church keep Saturday? Nobody keeps Saturday. Everybody keeps Sunday. Why do you do that? And so I would answer that question. Or they would, sometimes they would ask, why does your church drink beer? Because most Christians believe you should not have any alcohol at all. Why does your church allow people to have a glass of beer? And so we would answer a question like that. And then we would, after spending half an hour, 40 minutes in each one, then we would move on to the other one. And with a number of minutes on these bad roads in between, that was a full day. So here's another group, another smaller group that we got together with. Yet another one. This is the chief in his white robe sitting in the center there, very dignified gentleman. This is about the third time that I have been received by him. And I've actually been adopted by several of them. They've officially adopted me as their son. And at first I thought when they told me that I was adopted, I thought, does this mean I'm going to inherit my own village in Africa? Could I be the chief? And it turns out it's just a formal sort of thing. I don't actually inherit anything, but it means that I have a room in the chief's hut when I come to the village if I want to use it. So it's a nice gesture. This is another group. You can see the chief in the center with his hat and cane and some of his advisors. These are very colorful, picturesque types of places, and we probably had about close to 100 people here in this village that came to hear what we had to say. Yet another one, so we covered a lot of ground on the Friday before the first Holy Day. And here we are actually on the first day of unleavened bread in one of our congregations. This was kind of the first place where we started having baptized members. And they have built a hall, as you can see there. They've got a sign up with our church name on it. And I consider this kind of the home congregation in the area there. This is where we have most of our baptized members and our longest time members. So they're always very happy to see us, and I always enjoy being able to come here and meet with them. Here's Mr. Harper giving the sermonette during the service. And this is one of the few times that you will see Mr. Harper wearing a jacket. It's about 90 degrees and 90% humidity. So jackets really don't match well with the climate in Africa. And you can see that they cover everything with cloth as well. They're trying to make things as beautiful as they can and honor God by doing the very best they can with what they have. Here's another shot from the back of the hall. And you can see one of them's turning around to look at me. It's still very unusual in these places to have foreigners come in, light-skinned people come in. It's just very unusual, and they're very curious. So almost wherever we go, there are people watching us all the time. And often we'll have a trail of a dozen children walking around behind us as well. It's free entertainment. They don't have any television to watch, so they just walk around and follow us around to see what we're going to do. And sometimes it's rather amusing as well, because if one of them shuffles or makes a noise behind me, I'll turn around and they always jump like they don't know what I'm going to do next. You don't know about these foreigners. They're just unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. This was the afternoon service. We actually drove an hour between services, so we had a service in the morning for one congregation, then we had a service in the afternoon for another congregation. This is another one where we have 4 or 5 baptized members, and they have built their own little room as well, rather small, for services. This is the translator. Not everyone in all of these congregations speaks French. In fact, usually there are quite a few who don't. So while we're speaking in French, we need to be translated phrase by phrase into whatever the local language is. And this is pretty frequent when we work in Africa. So here's the translator, and you can see they've whitewashed the walls on the inside. Again, they don't have very much, but they do take seriously to honor God and to have as nice a meeting place for their services as they can. Our evenings up in the area of Man, they don't really have restaurants like we would think of a restaurant. What they have are places called maquis. And a maquis, roughly translated, is kind of a a bush restaurant, I guess you would say. And usually there are only two things on the menu. There's fish and chicken. And what they do is they don't have refrigeration either, so they just put it out on platters out on the counter in front of the restaurant, and you go and say, I want half of this chicken or I want this fish, and they'll take it back and prepare it and cook it, and about an hour later, you have to wait an hour for your order to come, it will arrive either with some sort of plantain or some sort of French fried potato or some other accompaniment like that. And it looks pretty good from a distance, and I zoomed in a little bit. I'll see how well this shows up here. You see all the little black bits on the chicken and the fish? Those are the flies. They were quite thick. So before we picked our chicken, we'd have to wave our hand over it a little bit and say, okay, I'll take this one here. That one seems a good one. So that's what we ate in the evenings. The next day, the following day after the Holy Day, we had a day of leadership seminars. Because we're only able to go up to Man about once a year, that's about as often as we're able to get up there. Obviously, we can't teach each individual person very much. We do on the Sabbath, obviously, with a sermon or a sermonette, we will do that. But we try to devote some time each time we go up there to leadership training for the local leadership who understand French. We can communicate with them directly, and we try to better equip them so that they can serve the others in the congregation who may need a translation or don't have as much education or don't know the Bible as well. So we had 3 seminar sessions on this day. I gave a first one on the topic of faithfulness among servants of God. Mr. Harper then gave an interactive one on the importance of parents teaching their children the way of God and giving some concrete ideas on how to do that. And then I gave another presentation afterwards, and I believe, I don't want to conflate all of these together, but one of the presentation I made here was about the role of women in the church. Because a lot of African churches are following the lead of a lot of Western churches, and they're erasing any distinctions between the roles of men and women in their church congregations. And so these people wanted to know, what does the Bible say about it? We want to do what the Bible says, but there's a lot of confusion out there. So please just show us in the Bible how we're supposed to do this. And I thought that was a wonderful attitude. They were very open to it. They didn't want to contest about it. They just said, show us what the Bible says. That's what we want to do. And so we were able to do that. And that was a very effective way for us to use the time that we had. So this is during the interactive part. Mr. Harper broke them down into discussion groups and got them suggesting different ideas for ways to teach their children, and it was a very productive one. So this was the group portrait of the men who were there for the leadership training. You see, some of them are smiling and some of them aren't. I think I've explained the smile thing to you before. In Africa, usually people look really grim in photographs. And I asked them one time, why is that? And they said, well, it's because if you smile, it means something good has happened to you. And basically, if something good has happened to you, that means you've come into some money. And because of the way the family structure is, if you've come into some money, the other members of your family have a right to a percentage of it. And so if you're smiling and happy, and they come and say, we want our share, and you say, I don't have any for you, they think you're holding out on them. It causes big problems in the family. So it's best just for us to look grim. And I said, okay, well, how about we do this? We'll do one African photo, and that's the one I will give you if I make copies. But then would you smile for me for the Americans? And I promise I won't show it any place in Africa. So some of them are willing to kind of step out on faith. You can see a few of them there. The others, they're not convinced yet. So we'll keep working on them. So after a rather long stay up in Man, a very full stay with power outages and bad roads and not so good food and all the rest of it, we were able to head back down to Abidjan once again. The roads got steadily better as we went along. And the last day that we were in Côte d'Ivoire, we went back out to Lamé, and to our joy, we saw that just that very morning Elise had given birth to a baby. Everybody was happy and healthy. And so we were able to see her and congratulate her, and actually we gave her a ride from the clinic where she had given birth back to her house so she wouldn't have to walk a mile through the village. That's what ladies normally do. They give birth in the morning and they're walking a mile home by that afternoon with their baby, and so we were able to give her a ride in the vehicle that we had, which was, as you can imagine, very much appreciated. So then we continued on, and our next stop was Lomé in Togo, and we pretty much just stayed in Lomé during this trip because that's where almost all of our members are concentrated. We did have a couple that traveled in from outlying areas for the Bible studies and the Sabbath services that we were going to have here. This is in Lomé. Now, this is a scene that happened repeatedly just about everywhere we went. When you arrive at an airport, and sometimes when you leave at an airport, somebody will point this thing that looks like a pistol at your forehead and pull the trigger. And it's rather startling, as you can see for this woman's expression here. It's actually an infrared thermometer. And they can take your temperature from a distance, sometimes from quite a distance, and they can read whether or not you have a fever. And that's because of the Ebola scare. So they're screening everybody, every airport, every place you go, they're screening you for fever so that they can catch somebody who might have Ebola and prevent him from traveling across borders and infecting a great many people. I've been reading up on Ebola since I have ended up traveling and working in this part of the world, and they have actually tracked down a number of people who infected hundreds of others. Because of where they were and the kind of behavior that they had. And so it's very important to screen this as much as possible. So pretty much every airport we went through, we received some sort of treatment like this. This is just a street scene, the kinds of things that you see on the street in Lomé or actually throughout most of Africa. Fruit stands, people selling whatever they have on the sidewalk. That's the way most things get bought and sold in this part of the world. This is a Bible study, the start of a Bible study that we had one evening in a member's home. This is actually a kind of a section of the home of one of our members there, someone who actually is a consultant for the United Nations, so he has a decent salary, certainly by local standards, and he's able to rent a nice house and a compound for his family. And we use this porch area for Bible studies and services. You'll notice that there are bars all over everything. You have to have that because of the crime. There are bars on every window, everywhere. It's just not safe to do it any other way. So we had a number of Bible studies. We had a seminar. We had multiple church services. We really did a lot of teaching here. And I won't take the time to go through all of the questions. I will refer you, if you're interested. I gave a pretty detailed account of this in my travel blog. There's a link to that on the akagwa.org website. So if you'd like to follow up, see some of the pictures, have more explanation given and more detail on the questions and answers. A lot of people find them very interesting because they're very deep questions. In some congregations more than others. And in Lomé here in particular, they really, really study their Bibles. And when I go there, every time I go there, I know I'm going to spend 2 or 3 hours answering questions about the Bible. Why does this happen? Why do we do this? Why do some other churches do that? What does this scripture mean? What happened here? And what's the backstory on this? Or why does it say this? They really study and they think about it and they write down their questions. And I know I'm going to spend 2 or 3 hours every time I go there answering really good, deep Bible questions. And that's very encouraging to see people who are really studying their Bibles and they're really thinking about it. They're talking to each other about it. And they have questions. They want to know why. They want to have a better understanding. So that we did this over the course of several days. This is Mr. Harper again giving his seminar on teaching our children the way of God. And when on a Sabbath or on a day when we have church, it's pretty much going to be an all-day affair. We'll have a service in the morning first thing before it starts getting too hot. We don't usually, in the U.S., we don't like our services to start too early in the morning. I guarantee you in Africa you would want them to start as early as possible because by the time it gets to be about 10 a.m., you've got sweat rolling down your bodies. So you want to get, before it starts getting too hot, while everybody can still stay alert, that's when you want to have Sabbath services. And then we'll have a break for a meal or something at noon, and then in the afternoon the children are allowed to go and the adults will gather and we'll have either a Q&A Bible study or a seminar or something of that nature. So this is what it's like on the back streets of Lomé. There are some good streets in the area and there's some streets that are just sand. This is right on the coast of the ocean here, so some of the back streets are not very good. This is most of the group. Not everybody was here for this photo, but this is most of the group that we have in Lomé. A very solid group, very knowledgeable. and very faithful. It's a real pleasure to go and visit here. The next country on the agenda was Cameroon. And you'll notice down at the bottom of the map here, I put some arrows. This is to show how we started in the city of Douala. That's where we landed in the plane. That's on the coast. And then we went up north to visit a couple of members in a very rural town, which I first visited probably 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago now. And then we also visited another family in another rural area as well, a family that's been associated with the church for 30 or more years, possibly 40 years. So these are people that go all the way back to worldwide, and these are now the children of, or sometimes the grandchildren of members who came into the church, as I mentioned, 30 to 40 years ago. So it is nice to be able to get back together with them again. Now you'll notice that I also put a large red oval along one border. This is the border with Nigeria, and this is the area that is being contested by Boko Haram, which has been in the news a great deal lately. It is an Islamic extremist group that's based in Nigeria. They tend to be more English-speaking rather than French-speaking as they would be in Cameroon. But the border is very porous, and there have been attacks on both sides of the border. And the people in Cameroon were very nervous. All through the country, people were talking about Boko Haram because they had shown that they could project their force very quickly. They could travel hundreds of miles into the country and then get back out again very quickly, much more quickly than the national armies had been able to do on either side of the border. So there was a lot of concern. There's a lot of fear. People are afraid. I have visited over the course of my ministry in this part of the world. I've been all the way up into the very northern part of Cameroon, and those places are just totally off limits. The U.S. government says do not go there. There is a high risk of being kidnapped. Boko Haram has specifically said that they're interested in kidnapping Westerners because that gets the media attention that they want. And these are the groups that are willing to behead people while they're still alive and all of that sort of thing. They have killed hundreds. They've kidnapped hundreds of schoolgirls on the Nigerian side of the border and have sold them into slavery. This is the kind of thing that has been going on here. Here's a screenshot from one of them. Bragging about the fact that he's the one that abducted the girls and he will sell them. And the people in Nigeria and in Cameroon are trying desperately to get those children back again. But there's simply no pity. They are executing people who are not Muslims. They will come into a town and they will just line people up and they will say a Muslim prayer. And if the person is incapable of saying a Muslim prayer from memory just like that, they shoot them dead. And then they move on to the next one. And they can kill hundreds of people in these villages, and this is what actually has happened. So it's understandable that there's a climate of fear in this area, and I felt it this time in a way that I'd never ever felt it before. I had never felt this level of fear just where everybody is concerned about it because nobody knows where they can pop up. We actually, so this is what it's like to drive up out of, well, first of all to Yaoundé, the capital, and then we drive further north. We had to leave the main road at one time. There was accidents and blockages, so we ended up kind of four-wheeling it for a while on back roads to get where we needed to go. And finally, we arrived up in this very remote village where we have on the far left a member named Jules, who I've known for some 20 years now. And he's standing next to a man named Simon, who's new to the church, new to the truth, but was very interested. He had lots of questions that he wanted to ask. That's Jules' wife and his children. The boy's name is Armstrong. That's his first name. Probably figure out where that came from. He goes back that far. So we were able to have about a 2.5-hour visit with this little group here. The other baptized member in the area was traveling. He was in another part of the country. And the difficulty that we have in communicating with these people is that they have no internet access in their village. And the nearest post office box and a working post office for them is about 20 miles away. And these are people who are living really hand to mouth. So even to pay taxi fare to get 20 miles to the village so that they can check their post office box, it becomes a major issue. I had sent them an airmail message, the way we often communicate, a month in advance, letting them know when we would be there. But because of the difficulty of getting to the post office box, they had not been informed until I called a couple of days ahead of time to confirm with them once we got in the country. So one of the members was not able to be there for the visit. But imagine the complexity that would put into your life, where there's no email, and even a post office box is a 20-mile trip for you with no vehicle of your own, having to go on bush taxi and pay the fare to do that. This is the way these folks live. This is inside Jules' living room, inside his house, and you can see he's holding a French edition of Discern magazine. They're very excited to have that in French. And Simon is holding a copy of our French calendar that we produce each year with the holy days on it and photos of the work. Because so many of our church brethren are isolated and scattered, we found it very encouraging for them just to have a calendar they can pin up on the wall, and it has photos. Sometimes they'll see a photo of themselves, and they will see a photo of other church members in other parts of the French-speaking world, and it just helps them feel a part of something bigger than themselves. They realize that they're not alone. Then we were on, this is about a 5 or 6 hour drive from the other village, the first village. We came into this little village in the south of the country. This village is actually located not too very far from where AIDS first appeared. Researchers have now, they're pretty much certain that the AIDS virus first appeared in southern Cameroon, right near the Congolese border, and then it made its way through human vectors down into the Congo. So that's how AIDS made it into the human population, so not too far from here. But this is the lady on the left. Her name is Melanie, and she grew up in the church. Her father was a baptized church member for many years. I met him, as I said, 20 years ago or so, and this family has more recently been with a different association of the Church of God, but they have said that they wish to be part of Kagwa now, and so that they asked me to come and visit them, and I did. But I vaguely remember them as children from 20 years ago, and they had some vague memories of me as well. So we spent parts of 2 days here. We spent a night in the village with them and just answered their questions. They had interesting questions as well. Why is the church split up into so many different groups? That's a good question to try to answer succinctly. And they had other Bible questions. Some of them wanted to talk about baptism. Two of the men here that you see in the photo actually grew up in the church, but they're close to middle age, and it's only now that they've made the decision, I really need to be baptized. So we were able to start helping some of them prepare for baptism as well, that's also a very encouraging thing. This is the kitchen. This is very typical of what a kitchen would be like. This is how most ladies prepare the food for their meals, over a charcoal fire. They're lucky if they have a table. That's not even always the case. And as I said, sometimes they don't even have a place indoors where they can do it. It's just outdoors or under a canopy of leaves, for example, leaves. And here's Melanie inside her kitchen. She was actually quite proud of her kitchen, and she was very proud of the meal that she prepared. This is the dishwasher. So this is how the dishes get washed afterwards. And this was the meal that Melanie had prepared, and she'd really gone out of her way to honor us for having made the trip out there and for coming to serve them as members of the body of Christ. So she laid out quite a spread. There was fish that had been braised, there was chicken, there was beef, and they'd even, I suppose, borrowed some money, I would imagine, and they found a bottle of French wine, which they had on the table as well, to welcome us. You can see that in the middle of the table there. So this was the meal that we had. And it really was quite good. It was very tasty. And I will admit, sometimes in this part of the world, when you see what people have to work with, they're doing the best they can to keep everything clean. But when you see what the kitchen is like, and you realize they don't really have access to very clean water, they're using whatever they have available, I will admit that when I ask the blessing on the meal, I'm a little more fervent over there than I might be here. Not that I'm not fervent here, but there's a little extra fervency in asking God's blessing on the food. And we didn't have any trouble. So here are the two of the men who had grown up in the church and were very interested now in talking about baptism. So that was quite encouraging for us as well. So we spent all afternoon with them one day. We slept in the village, and then we came back out in the morning and had another meeting with them before taking back to the road. We made one little detour to show Mr. Harper. He'd never seen this before. These are the waterfalls in Kribi on the coast. What's interesting about these waterfalls is that they dump right into the ocean. So this is, if I could rotate the camera around behind me, you would see it's the ocean. And this river just dumps directly into the ocean over this waterfall. So it's rather famous in Cameroon. The next stop that we made was the Congo. This is the Congo. This was my view out of the front taxi window. You can see how cracked it all is. That is par for the course. The cars are really rolling wrecks many times. And it's not that you can't have a better vehicle, but they're very expensive to rent. And this is something that we have to deal with over there. A lot of times, we will take a step down or maybe 2 steps down from what we would normally think of the minimum that we would want in the West, but we have to bring things down a little bit to their level. We can't come in. It would be for us, for example, as if a minister came in to visit us and he's driving in a Porsche or he's driving in a Maserati. We would have questions about that. That would seem out of place, would it not? So if we come in a nice, even a nice Toyota, but it's new, it's the same kind of thing. So we oftentimes will take a couple of steps down in what we travel in. We'll take the minimum that we can get by with so that we are not causing offense to our brethren in these parts of the world. The Congo things are improving a little bit materially, but there's still a lot of infrastructure problems. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and you can see that a lot of things haven't been repaired for a long time. This is a main street right in the center of Kinshasa. Another street on which some of our church brethren live. This is a photo I took on the way to services one morning. You see these ladies have large baskets of French loaves of bread on their head. They're just coming out of a bread factory. We would call it a bakery, but basically it's just a huge factory. And ladies will go in and they'll buy a tub full of bread like this, and they'll carry it out on their heads, and they'll walk around the streets selling bread and making just a few cents on each loaf. And if they can, whatever they make at the end of the day, that's the money that they've had to eat with at the end of the day. So people live very much hand to mouth. It's a very, very difficult situation economically, especially in the Congo. We have now rented a church hall for their use because we have about 70 people attending now in Kinshasa when everybody can get there. There's a huge UN presence, UN peacekeeping presence in the Congo. In fact, there are more UN peacekeepers in Congo than in any other country in the world right now. And that's because the violence has been so continuous. I mentioned before that in the Congo, at any given time, there may be 3 different wars going on, and they're unconnected to each other. It's a huge country. It's a very rich country in mineral wealth. If you have a smartphone on your hip right now, probably part of that came from someplace in the Congo. And that's one reason that there's so much violence and bloodshed there. A warlord who can grab a particular part of the country, even just for a few months, can become very rich. So that's why the UN is so present there. And whenever the UN goes in big time, these are your tax dollars at work, They take the best. They rent the best. They buy the big white vehicles. It's always new, 4-wheel drive, Prados, the whole thing, and they go in style. They stay in the best hotels. And what that does is it drags the prices up for everything for the local population as well. And so feelings are mixed about the UN being there. Some people are happy they're there. Other people see the downside to it, and they're not so happy that the UN is present so effectively. So after services, we had a baptismal counseling session for 13 people all at the same time. And that also is encouraging as well to see so many people who are interested. This is the group portrait of everyone who was present for the Sabbath service that we had here in Kinshasa in the Congo. We've had a lot of growth in attendance. We haven't started to see a whole lot of baptisms yet, but we do have people that are in the process of preparing for that, so that's encouraging. One of the things that we brought in to 2 members on this trip were used laptops. We especially like the very small ones because we can get maybe 2 in a suitcase. And so this is Mr. Harper. This was a used laptop that used Linux instead of Windows, and so he was giving a few explanations on how to operate this for one of our local leaders there. This will enable him to keep up with his email a little bit better and improve our communication. So we had a relatively short time in the Congo. We did find when we got to the airport in the middle of the night, because we had a midnight flight, we arrived on time and we're told, oh, sorry, the flight's been canceled. Go back to town, come back tomorrow morning. This is par for the course as well. Now, as I mentioned before, from the Congo, we were going to go into Burundi, but the situation in Burundi is extremely difficult right now. There have been a lot of deaths. It's ongoing. This is a headline in Rwanda that says 3,000 refugees every day are coming from Burundi crossing the border into Rwanda. And these are tiny countries. They're very, very small. So there's a lot of pre-electoral violence that's occurring. There have been a lot of people killed. There have been grenade attacks, and Bujumbura itself, the capital city, is pretty much locked down. I wanted to read you a message that I got just last night from one of our lead members in Burundi, and he lives in Bujumbura. So he wrote me in French, and I translated it for you. This was his message. The situation here in Burundi is not at all reassuring because almost the whole capital of Bujumbura is paralyzed since the 25th of April, when the outgoing president was once again presented by his party to seek a third mandate. Constitution says he can only be elected twice. Demonstrations broke out in several quarters of Bujumbura. In our quarter, the situation is remaining calm, but we are stuck at home since Monday, the 4th of May, and since the demonstrations began, there have been many dead and wounded. In the interior of the country, such as at Cibitoke Mugina, and that's where most of our brethren are, there is still calm, but there is no connection with the capital to acquire supplies, foodstuffs, and other basic needs. In short, if nothing changes, the country is heading for another genocide because a militia already armed is committing many atrocities, working in collaboration with the police who are favorable to a third term. But we hope that our good God will give us what we need and give us a future. Think still of us to help us through your prayers. So I hope you will add your prayers to mine for the group that is there. We often hear about the genocide in Rwanda. There was actually a lot of genocidal activity in Burundi as well. The same tribal elements are present. The same pressure cooker is there. And it's not impossible that they would actually tip back into genocide as a result of what's going on here now. This is the group. Obviously, I wasn't able to go up on this trip, but this is from a previous trip. In fact, this is a trip that Mr. Franks made a couple of years ago up to Mugina, up in the northern part. This area, there has been a couple of grenade attacks in Cibitoke, which is not very far from here, but it has not made it out as far as the rural villages where our brethren are living. So that's encouraging. Then we flew on to Kenya. We were to go to Burundi, but we canceled that, obviously. So we ended up with a couple of extra days in Kenya. And I decided we hadn't really had any time off, so I was able to arrange for 2 days in a national park in Kenya. And so we were able to, this is the porch to our tent. Mr. Harper and I shared a tent, pretty luxurious tent, I will say, but a tent nonetheless. And what you can see out in the Mara River in front of us are hippopotamus. There are hundreds of them that live out there, and they would actually come up and graze outside our tent at night. I stepped it off in the morning. You could see they're very heavy animals, so you can tell where they've been standing and walking around. And one of them woke me up at night, and the next morning I went off and I paced it off, and he'd been grazing 10 feet from my head in my bed. And there was nothing between us but canvas. Fortunately, he didn't know that. So you can see this is one of the most amazing places in Africa to see wildlife, and you were able to actually get quite close to it. Hyena. And what's often most impressive are the lions, and you actually can get quite close to them as well. We came across this pride that was eating a zebra that had just been killed probably that morning or the night before. And when you see a lion ripping into a piece of meat, you see how big those cats are. It gives you a whole new respect for them. And I mentioned before, it made me think of Peter's admonition to beware of our adversary who walks about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And if you ever see a lion devouring something, it makes a very deep impression, and that scripture takes on new life. One of the interesting things that happened there, and I wanted to share this with you too, there were a couple of guides or rangers, I guess you would say, at the place where we stayed. They're armed. One of them had a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and the other one had a .458 Winchester Magnum, which is an elephant gun. And they actually will escort you out to walk. You can walk out among the animals. So you're not in a fenced area. You're just out walking around on the Serengeti Plain with the lions and whatever else happens to be out there. And it's quite impressive to do that. But that wasn't what was so impressive about this. What was impressive was that they found out we were pastors, And these men are Christians, as they understand it at least. And they're very concerned there as well because of not Boko Haram this time, but Al-Shabaab, which has perpetrated several atrocities inside of Kenya. Just recently, they broke into a university, they stormed a university, and they killed 147 students at last count, just in cold blood. And it was a similar kind of thing. Say a prayer, say a Muslim prayer. And if they couldn't say a Muslim prayer, they shot them, just point blank. And it was rather poignant because this man in the prime of life, he said, what are we supposed to do? He said, we're Christians. We're not supposed to take revenge. We're not supposed to be violent. We're not supposed to kill people. But who will protect us? Who is going to protect us? And this is a question that they're all asking themselves. The army doesn't seem capable of doing it. The government doesn't seem capable of doing it. These atrocities are happening over and over again. And I did the best I could to reassure him that God looks out after his own and that we have promises of a resurrection even if things don't go well in this life, and pointed him toward the example of Jesus himself, who was martyred for doing the right thing. And I tried to encourage him as much as I could, but it was quite striking, the poignancy in his voice as he was asking about this. He really was just at a loss. What are we supposed to do? Where is our safety now? And more people in Africa are asking that question. And I would submit to you, not just in Africa. Our final stop was in Rwanda. We flew on to Rwanda, where we have about 70 members attending as well. This is Kigali. Then we would drive up into the lush hills of Rwanda, and on some rather poor roads. It's about a 2-hour drive from Kigali to get up to this village of Giti, where we have a church hall, and we are just about to get electricity in the hall. It's been years making its way up there, but we're about to have an electrical connection up there, which is really going to transform the Feast of Tabernacles, for example. This is Mr. Harper with a translator. James is translating into Kinyarwanda during our Sabbath service. We also had some baptismal counseling. We had a day of leadership seminars, once again, similar to what we had done previously. And then we took time to visit some of the members in their homes. And this took almost a day because it's difficult to get out to where they live. This is their home. Laurent is the man's name here. His house, he built it himself out of mud brick. It's got a dirt floor and a little bit of cement on the outside. This is a lady whose husband abandoned her, and so she's living in this house with a nephew who farms the land for her and helps her make ends meet. And this is Matthias and his wife and sons. Matthias has a fascinating story because at the age of 19, he was dragooned into the Rwandan army. That is, he was just walking down the street, a truck stopped in front of him, some big burly guys got out, grabbed him by both arms, put him in the truck, and took him to basic training. And he spent the next 9 years of his life in the army. He was sent across the border to fight against those who had committed the genocide. They had fled into the Congo. He was sent in with his unit, poorly trained, to try to fight these men. There were other African countries that got involved. Zimbabwe sent troops to support the Congolese side. And he had just really painful stories to tell about not having enough to eat, to the point where they would eat raw food that actually is noxious to you when it's raw. It needs to be prepared, but they were just so hungry they ate it raw anyway and ran the risk of becoming sick from it. So he had quite a harrowing story to tell. And yet, the ending of it was a happy ending, I guess you could say, because here he is now. He's got a plot of land. He has a loving, supportive wife. He has 3 sons in good health. And one of the things he told us was that what he had, even more importantly than that, was that he understood God's plan for him. He understood that there was going to be a happy ending for people in the end. And that was a very poignant moment, I think you would agree, to have somebody be able to tell a story like that. This is a dangerous, difficult part of the world, but the same solutions are there for Africa that we need in this country, which is God's way of life and ultimately, of course, the return of Jesus Christ. Trips like the one that I just described to you, and I make them several times a year, cause me to come home with a mix of different emotions and thoughts. These trips are tiring. They're tiring physically, and they're tiring emotionally as well, as you can imagine. Maybe you're feeling a little tired having just watched all of that. I have people tell me after reading my travel blog, they're tired. It is tiring to see this whole range of so many different things that are going on, happy things and tragic things and things that we can't stop, no matter how much we would like to do so. There are happy things that happen on these trips, encouraging things, seeing old friends, being able to baptize people, help them become part of the body of Christ, seeing babies born and the happiness that that brings in any culture. Sometimes the help that we can provide as a church, the educational help, where we see the light turn on in people's minds and they begin to understand new ways of doing things, new ways of living their lives. That's wonderfully encouraging. Sometimes we're able to help people even physically with some needs that they have, like a laptop or something of that nature, or buying a new panel of tin to help repair someone's roof. There are little things like that that we can do that are encouraging. But then there are sad things, even tragic things that we see up close when we go to this part of the world. There is fear. And the fear was palpable this time in Africa. People are afraid. They don't know what the future holds, and they don't know where to turn for help. They realize how helpless they are in those situations. People are suffering. There's abuse, terrible abuse at lots of different levels. There's violence. I see things I really would like to stop, and I'm powerless to stop them. I can't fix what's wrong with the places that I visit, nor can you. We just can't. But I was particularly struck on this trip by how many evils were growing and affecting more people. There was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and the fear that that caused in people. There was what Boko Haram was doing in Nigeria and Cameroon, the mindless violence, the cruelty. There was Al-Shabaab in Kenya and Burundi and other areas in Somalia where they're doing terrible things to people, just flat-out murder. There was a civil unrest in Burundi that prevented us from visiting our church brethren there. Basically, it's a tussle over who's going to be in power, so who's going to make the money. And it's just human nature at work. And, of course, it's the little people and the innocent who suffer. I come home from these trips thankful for physical blessings that I can easily take for granted. Clean water. I can stick my glass under the tap at home and drink that water and not have to worry about it. I can't do that over there. We have a stable electrical grid. We have air conditioning. If I see a policeman approach me, I don't have to worry that he's going to want a bribe, which is often the case in many of these places where I go. We have great medical care. If I have a car accident going home today on 75, I'll probably be taken, if I survive it, to a good hospital with excellent pain medication to limit the suffering that I might have to undergo. That's just not true in much of the world, certainly in most of Africa. You have to pay first before they let you into the hospital. Even if you need to go to the emergency room, you can't get in unless you've got money to give them, and most people don't. And you have to buy the drugs that you're going to use and pay cash for them up front. If you need pain medication, you've got to have the cash or you're not going to have it. I could tell you stories of going to a dentist office in Rwanda, for example, and hearing people screaming in pain because they were having a cavity filled with no painkiller. They couldn't afford it. They just didn't have the money for it. That's a way of life. And seeing the way some of the hospitals are, they're really not very impressive, I can tell you, especially if you get out of the main cities. Some of us that work over there all the time, we have a joke, and it's only partially a joke, but the joke goes, if I have a car accident, don't take me to the hospital, just finish me off at the scene of the accident. I would rather just have it be over than wake up in one of those places. And, of course, we're joking when we say that. But we have many blessings still in the Western countries as a result of the promises that God gave to Abraham. But you've no doubt noticed, brethren, I bet you've been feeling this as you watch the news and you see what's happening. Some of those blessings are now being removed. We're losing some of the blessings that we used to have, the stability, the unity in the country. The Western Christian nations are turning away from the Bible, and as they do that, those blessings are going to continue to be removed. And we're not going to have the safety and the stability that we used to have. 9/11 was quite a shock to us, but that was only the first of several. We've had things like what happened at Fort Hood. And I'm sure you were struck as I was by what happened last Sunday in Garland, where two fellows propounding to be from ISIS were going to commit a mass murder if they could, and they were armed to do it. I did a search on the internet. That hall in Garland was 15 miles from where you're sitting right now. These things are getting closer to home. They're coming close. When we had our mini Ebola outbreak here in Dallas, those cases were in a hospital. I did a check on that. That's 4 miles from where you're sitting right now. That was pretty close. These things are getting close to home for us now. And you're watching the news as I am. In the United States at this time, we're on a knife's edge on moral issues about which God cares very much, whatever pundits may claim about it. The U.S. Supreme Court is about to decide a case that might well impose homosexual marriage on every state in the Union, whether the people in that state want it or not. It's going to be imposed. And we don't know how that's going to come out now, but we're on the cusp of something like that. And the latest craze now in sexual immorality is gender identity. You're going to be hearing a lot more about that as well, where mixed up people, even though they're a man, they think they're a woman. Or even though they're a woman, they want to start acting like a man and dressing like a man. And we're imposing this on our children in school. We're telling them that's the way it is. We're mixing up the next generation and confusing them about who they are and how God made them. And the farther we get away from the truths of the Bible and away from God's way, the worse the situation is going to be. And I mention that, brethren, just because coming back from Africa this time, I thought, we really need to prepare because things are not going to get better soon. They will get better ultimately, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. And a lot of people in this country are asleep. They don't realize the changes that are happening. And one day they're going to wake up and it's going to be terrible because they won't have been aware of where we've been going for such a long time. Look in Matthew chapter 24, if you would. We know some of the things that Jesus prophesied. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, verse 21. This is yet ahead of us. This is where the world is heading, and we're in this world. Then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. No flesh would be saved alive, as some versions translate it. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. It's going to get very serious, to the point where humanity might commit collective suicide if God didn't intervene. It's hard for us to imagine that kind of chaos and that kind of tribulation. But that's what Jesus Christ himself said is ahead of us. That's where the world is going. It also says in verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. The church still has an ongoing mission. Whatever the conditions around us are like, we have got to continue doing the work of God. We've got to keep preaching the gospel. And just as God punished ancient Israel for their sins, as our Western nations turn away from God and go deeper and deeper into sin, we're going to be punished as well, nationally. Collectively, there will be punishments on our people. But we have to remember, brethren, and this is kind of the main point that I would like to leave with you today, we are called to be faithful in doing God's will and fulfilling the mission of the church, whatever the circumstances around us. We need to begin preparing ourselves mentally and emotionally and certainly spiritually for some very difficult times ahead because they're coming. Some of our African brethren are doing their best to be Christians right now, today, under a threat of war. For some of them, they're worried about being captured and tortured or murdered by bloodthirsty Islamist rebels. People worry about that. Some of us, we have brethren living in places where something like that could happen. Look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. 1 Peter 3:15 is probably a verse that you know by heart. I'd like to break it down for us to think about this as a responsibility each one of us has and look at it specifically in the context of a darkening world and what this might mean for the future. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. It's interesting. When you think about what's written in those two verses, we're actually given a list of responsibilities that we have as Christians. And as the world becomes darker, it's going to be more of a challenge to continue doing this. But this is something we're supposed to be doing. What are the specific elements that are mentioned here? First of all, it says, sanctify God in your heart. Keep God separate from and above all other values that we have, everything else. He's got to be above all, separate from all the other values that we have in our life. That's the starting point. The second thing it says is to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. And that means we've got to keep that hope vibrant and alive. We can't let ourselves get discouraged and overwhelmed by what we see happening in the world around us. And the way we can avoid doing that is by sanctifying God in our hearts, by keeping Him in first place, above all other values, all other goals that we would have. The third thing it says is that we've got to answer with meekness and respect. That's a way of life, to be respectful. That's going to become more of a challenge, I believe, because the world is becoming less respectful. It's becoming in your face. It's becoming rude. It's just becoming mean. People have no thought of courtesy for one another, at least many people. More and more people don't feel like they owe that to anybody. They disagree with you, they can just be brutal and mean to you. But we're called to answer with meekness and respect and to make that a way of life. And then it says we're supposed to keep a clear conscience. Obey God. And if you and when you realize you've made a mistake, repent and get clean again. Keep a clear conscience. Those things are going to be a challenge as the world goes over the edge. And I would like for us to take just a minute or two and consider an admonition that God gave to one of His servants during the days of Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived in a very difficult time. He was called by God to work in the last days of the kingdom of Judah before its conquest by the Babylonians. And for decades, possibly 40 years, he faithfully delivered God's warning to the kings of the nation and the people of the nation, and they would not hear him. He lived and worked under the authority of some good men, some evil men, a lot of weak men, a lot of self-willed and ambitious men, and yet he had to continue doing the will of God. Jeremiah was from a priestly, well-off family. He probably had hopes and dreams in his youth, and then God called him to do something different, something else that was vitally important, but probably not what Jeremiah had planned. And as far as we know, in all the work that he did, he only had one faithful associate. At least he's the only one named. His associate was named Baruch. And Baruch, from what we know of him, also came from an influential family of noble birth. He was the grandson of a governor of Jerusalem under King Josiah. His brother had been the chief chamberlain in the court of Zedekiah. He was a talented, capable man. But he was called by God not to pursue his own goals, but to help Jeremiah do the work that God had given him to do. Turn to Jeremiah 45. We get a really interesting glimpse here, and this will be the last passage we'll look at. Jeremiah 45. It's a really short chapter here, and it's just about a message that God sent to Baruch. Jeremiah 45. We're going to read these 5 verses here. The word that Jeremiah the prophet spoke to Baruch the son of Neriah when he had written these words in a book at the instruction of Jeremiah. That's actually a reference to a scroll that's mentioned in Jeremiah 36. So if you want to know what was written down, you can check that later. It was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, saying, this was a message that God was giving specifically to Baruch. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, to you, O Baruch, you said, woe is me now, for the Lord has added grief to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighings, and I find no rest. Baruch was grieved by the work that he and Jeremiah had to do, the constant warnings that went unheeded for decade after decade. And his pain and his grief wore him out. And all the grievous emotions that he felt exhausted him. And apparently he complained to God. He said, you've added grief to my sorrow. I just can't do it. It's overwhelming. I find no rest. Verse 4, thus you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, behold, what I have built I will break down, and what I have planted I will pluck up, that is the whole land. In other words, God is telling him, Baruch, you're living in momentous times. There's some very important things that have to happen in your lifetime for my plan to be fulfilled. And it's not an easy time, but it's part of my plan. This is the necessary work for the time that you're living in. I'm going to fulfill all my will and complete my plan. And you have a part to play in that. Verse 5, do you seek great things for yourself? Was Baruch doing that? Did he have his own plans? He had his own dreams about what he wanted to do with his life. Well, I want to do this and I want to do that. He was a wealthy, well-connected man. Maybe he saw himself in some other position. But God said, no, I want you to assist Jeremiah. That's your job. And it's really important that you do that job. Do what I've asked you to do. Do not seek them. Don't seek your own things. For behold, I will bring adversity on all flesh, says the Lord. But I will give you your life to you as a prize in all places wherever you go. Baruch was not supposed to be concerned about his own welfare and his own position, his own plans and ambitions. He wasn't supposed to be self-seeking, as so many people are today. When the nation was going to suffer drastic judgment, instead of making demands on God, he was, according to what God told him, he should be satisfied with the fact that his life was spared and he was playing an important part in the plan of God. I think that's quite a fascinating interaction that God had with Baruch. And it's encouraging. Even the commentators are kind of split. Was it really corrective of Baruch? It was kind of, but it was also very encouraging. I'm watching over you. I have your life in my hand, and I will take care of you because I have an important mission for you to accomplish. There was a suggestion there at the end that he was going to have to flee for his life. All the places wherever you go, you're going to have to flee for your life. But I have your life in the palm of my hand, and I will watch over you. I think that's an important lesson for us to remember. Remember Baruch. As things become more difficult in our nations and all around the world, it will be very important to keep our focus on God's plan and on His will, because that's what really counts. Not our ambitions, not our desires for this life. Not that we can't plan. We shouldn't have plans. We should. And young people especially, you should be really planning and thinking about the right way to use the life that God has given you. It's important to plan. But we also have to understand that sometimes it's not going to be possible to fulfill all the plans we have for our lives, because it's God's plan that really counts the most. And that's what we've been called. That's our calling, is to participate in the accomplishment of that plan. Our main focus, what is most important to us, must be faithfully fulfilling the responsibilities that God has given us as time goes forward. His plan is truly what counts. His plan will be accomplished, and we've got to keep our eyes raised and look at the ultimate goal at the end of it, and not allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the negative news of the immediate, because that is going to happen. So I hope you will think about some of these things. I hope you'll think about the different points that Peter gave us in 1 Peter chapter 3. Sanctify God, keep Him apart. Be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you and make sure that hope stays there and stays vibrant. Answer with meekness and respect. Keep that as your way of life. And keep a clear conscience. And remember Baruch. We got to remember what our number one priority must be, and that is accomplishing and fulfilling the will of God.